check. Later, if it is covered under the definition of supply, whether there is a levy on that particular item is whether there is a levy on this particular topic needs to be checked. Then, what is the rate of tax at which the item is to be taxed will be checked. And after this, to check whether a transaction will fall within the ambit of intrastate transaction or an interstate transaction, one has to check the place of supply of the transaction. After getting into all these items, one will check the time of supply of the particular transaction to check when the liability to pay tax to the government arises. Now, we'll dwell into details of each item one by one. Now, before I get into this topic, I have a question. Can GST be levied on all transactions and any transaction which is being carried out only within India or outside India also a taxation by the name of GST could be levied? So the answer is very simple. The extent of this act is to whole of India. So any transaction which happens in India is only to be taxed within G, is only to be taxed by the CGST Act. So now we'll go to section 1. Section 1 says that this act may be called the Central Goods and Service Tax Act and it will extend to whole of India. The question arises, okay, what do I mean by the term India? So India is defined in section 2 subclause 56. Now wherever I have mentioned the sections and I have not mentioned the act, it means that it is from the CGST Act, that is the Central Goods and Service Tax Act. Wherever I have made a particular reference of an IGST Act, I have specifically written that it is pertaining to IGST Act. Now, India is defined under Section 2, subclause 56 of the CGST Act. The definition of India given in this act is an exhaustive definition as it starts with the word means. So if you see, India is defined as to mean the territory of India as referred to in Article 1 of the Constitution. So Article 1 में जो लिखा है Constitution में कि India का meaning क्या है, that will be India, along with territorial waters, seabed, subsoil underlying such water. It will also include continental shelf, exclusive economic zone, and other maritime zones as defined under the Maritime Zone Act 1976. Apart from this, now we've discussed about the landmass, that is territory of India. We've talked about the waters or the continental shelf. Also, airspace above the territory and territorial waters will be included in the definition of India. So, what analogy can be drawn from here is इंडिया का डेफिनेशन क्या होगा? सो इंडिया विल इंक्लूड द टेरिटरी, द लैंडमास ऑफ इंडिया, the territorial waters, continental shelf, exclusive economic zone, and the airspace above the territory and the territorial waters. To give a better understanding, I have made a pictorial representation of it. So if you see, this is India. From 12 nautical miles from the landmass will be your territorial waters. And beyond 12 nautical miles will be your exclusive economic zone till 200 nautical miles. And beyond it will be high seas. High seas. So now, whenever a transaction takes place in territorial waters, will it be treated as India? Will it be treated as India? So my answer is yes, it will be India. And GST will be chargeable as the definition of India includes territorial waters. Now, if a person is carrying out business in exclusive economic zone, will it also be treated as a part of India? So, if you read the definition, it says India will include continental shelf and exclusive economic zone as well. So, any transaction which takes place up to 200 nautical miles will be covered within the India and it will be chargeable to GST. Now, moving ahead, I had a query saying that if any service is provided in the airspace, if you see, there is a service which is being provided in the airspace above the exclusive economic zone. Will this transaction also be chargeable to GST under the definition of India? So if you read the definition of India, For airspace, it includes only territory and territorial waters. So the airspace only above the territorial waters is included, not above the exclusive economic zone. So any transaction or any services provided in the airspace of exclusive economic zone will not be covered within India. Moving to supply. Now that we are aware कि GST कहाँ पे लगाया जाएगा, now let's dwell into supply. Now, for any transaction to be taxed, there has to be goods or services. या तो गुड्स दिए हो जाने चाहिए या फिर सर्विसेज दी जानी चाहिए, और इस चीज का क्या होना चाहिए, गुड्स या सर्विसेज का सप्लाई होना चाहिए. एंड ऑन दिस सप्लाई देयर शुड बी अ लेवी. व्हेन ऑल दीज ट्रांजैक्शंस आर देयर, देन एंड ओनली देन जीएसटी कैन बी लेविड. तो क्या क्या होगा, एक तो गुड्स या फिर सर्विसेज होनी चाहिए, उसका सप्लाई होना चाहिए, and there should be a levy on this particular transaction, and then and only then GST can be levied. Now moving to section 7. Before moving to section 7, I would like to define what do you mean by the term goods and services. So goods in GST is defined under section 2 subclause 52 of CGST Act. Goods means every kind of movable property. So goods का definition जो है, that is an exhaustive definition, as it starts with the term means. Wherever any definition starts with the term means, it is an exhaustive definition. Wherever it is starting with includes, it will be an illustrative definition, which means it will have a wide implication. Means the terms which are mentioned in the definition are only illustrative, and it could mean anything other than that also. So goods means every kind of movable property other than money and security, but includes actionable claim, growing crops, grass, and things attached to or forming part of the land, which are agreed to be severed before supply or under a contract of supply. So now, firstly, for a transaction to be goods, it should be a movable property per se. अगर मूवेबल नहीं है तो वो गुड्स ही नहीं होगा. So any transaction which is in relation to, let's say, immovable property will not fall within the ambit of goods definition. Moving ahead, अगर कोई transaction में money या security involved है, it will also outside the ambit of goods. For example, if I borrow, let's say, 5 lakh from someone and I repay him after, let's say, 2 months, will this transaction be goods? So the answer is no, as money and securities are excluded from the definition. Moving ahead, it also includes actionable claims. So the term goods includes actionable claim. Actionable claim has not been defined in the GST law per se, but the definition has been borrowed from the Transfer of Property Act. Actionable claim means a right in the movable property, which can be claimed by the holder of that right. Then there is growing crops, grass, and things attached or forming part of the land. So for example, let's assume that I have a piece of land and on that I have a plantation of timber. Now, what I want to do is, I before getting it cut down, I transfer the land to, let's say, Mr. A, and Mr. A cuts down the timber and gives the land back to me. Now, one could argue that this being a transaction in supply of land being outside the ambit, आगे हम पढ़ेंगे कि सप्लाई के डेफिनेशन से कुछ चीजें बाहर की गई है, उसमें से एक आइटम है सेल ऑफ लैंड. बट पर से इफ यू सी दिस ट्रांजैक्शन इज नॉट ऑफ सेल ऑफ लैंड, बट there was timber which was standing on that land which has been cut down by the person who had received this land. So any such transaction which is there wherein crops or growing things which are there on the land have been given will also be treated as supply of goods. Now, once we have seen the definition of goods, move into the definition of services. Services means anything other than goods, money and securities. तो कोई भी चीज जो गुड्स नहीं है वो क्या होगी, सर्विस होगी. तो अगर आप डेफिनेशन देखते हो सर्विसेज की, ऑल्दो इट स्टार्ट्स विद द टर्म मींस, इट इज अ वेरी वाइड डेफिनेशन बिकॉज इट सेज गुड्स को एक्सक्लूड करके, मनी एंड सिक्योरिटीज को एक्सक्लूड करके बाकी जो भी चीजें रहेगी विल बी ट्रीटेड एज सर्विसेज. It also includes activities relating to use of money or its conversion by cash or by any other mode from one form, currency or denomination to other form or currency or denomination for which a separate consideration is charged. So let's understand this. Let's say that I had rupees 1 lakh in cash. I wanted a DD to be made out of this cash that I had. So I go to the bank, I deposit the money and ask them to give me a demand draft against the deposition made. Now, what is happening is the form in which the money was held has been changed. From hard cash, I've converted it into demand draft. And for this activity, they've charged me some commission. So, will this activity be goods or service? This will be service. Let's assume that I have Indian rupees. I go and convert it into dollars, let's say. And a separate consideration as a form of commission is being charged. So, what will this be? This will be service. So any use of money or conversion from one form, currency or denomination for which separate consideration is charged will also be treated as services. Now, an explanation was inserted for removal of doubts which says that service includes facilitation or arranging transaction and security. So although securities are outside the ambit of GST, but any activity which relates to facilitation of securities transaction will be covered within the definition of services. So let's assume there is a broker who charges brokerage for selling of securities. Will that be a service? Answer is yes. So broadly, so goods will be movable property. Services will be anything other than goods. Money and securities have been excluded from the definition of both goods as well as services. Now that we are clear with what goods and services mean, let's move ahead to the definition of supply. So, supply basically is nothing but a taxable event under GST. So, what do you mean by the taxable event? So, under indirect taxes, whenever an event occurs, it will trigger the taxability. So let's assume in the erstwhile regime, we had value added tax, which was known as VAT. There was Service Tax Act, which was there. There was excise duty, which was there. All of this act had different taxable events. For example, if we talk about VAT, VAT was taxable at the time of sale, whereas service was taxable at the time of provisioning of services. And central excise duty was taxable at the time of manufacture. So all these are what taxable event. It is the event which would trigger the taxability. So under GST, the taxable event is supply. The term supply has been defined in section 7, which is divided into broad three parts. One is what will be included in supplies. The second part is what is to be excluded from supplies. And once we have determined that a transaction is supply, and if there is any ambiguity, it will be ambiguity in terms of whether I treat it as supply of goods or a supply of service. This will be determined by section 7(1)(a) or 7(3). So, starting with what is included in supply. So, supply includes general supply, which we'll be reading ahead. Then there are transactions between members of AOP and BOI. Then there is import of services when made will also be included in supplies. And there are some activities wherein they are deemed as supply. So these are mentioned in Schedule 1. Then talking about what are things which are excluded from supply. So Schedule 3 transactions which are there are excluded from supply, and any activities performed by the central government, state government, local authority as a public authority are excluded from the definition of supply. Now, once I am clear about what is to be included and what is to be excluded in supply, the question arises कि जो चीज मैंने सप्लाई की है क्या वो सप्लाई ऑफ गुड्स है या सप्लाई ऑफ सर्विस. अगर एम्बिग्युइटी है तो देयर इज अ शेड्यूल 2 which is there, which is to be referred to determine whether a transaction will qualify as a goods or services. Let's take an example. Ambiguity कब arise होगी? So if you see, let's take an example of restaurant service. Now, when I am availing restaurant services, I go there to eat. Now, the food which is brought or which is served is goods per se, whereas the act of making that goods available is service. So there is a question or a dilemma which appears कि इसको मैं क्या qualify करूँ, goods बोलूँ या service बोलूँ. Similar problem arises in, let's say, a works contract arrangement जहाँ पे goods भी है and services भी involved है. So for such transactions, schedule 2 is to be referred to check the determination of the supply. So first we'll see what all things are included in supply. So supply starts with section 7(1), which says that for the purpose of this act, the expression of supply includes. Now the term used here is includes, which means it is an illustrative definition. Clause A, all forms of supply of goods or services or both, such as sale, transfer, barter, exchange, license, rental, lease, or disposal, made or agreed to be made for a consideration by a person in the course or furtherance of business. So if you see this supply definition, it is very wide. It says कि goods और services का sale हो, transfer हो, barter हो, exchange हो, इन 8 चीजों में से कुछ भी हो, for a consideration between person and in the course of business, it will be treated as supply. So for any transaction to qualify supply, all these ingredients have to be available. एक तो ये 8 चीजों में से कुछ होना चाहिए. Then there has to be consideration for that supply. It should be between persons and it should be in the course or furtherance of business. Any of this element, if it is missing, the transaction cannot qualify as supply. For example, sale, transfer, barter है, ठीक है, but consideration नहीं है. So will it qualify as supply? Answer is no, under subsection 1 clause A. सर ये इतने सारे टर्म्स यूज करने की क्या जरूरत है? सेल, ट्रांसफर, एक ही बारे में सेल्स बोल देते हैं, ट्रांसफर बोल देते हैं. ये 8 टर्म्स क्यों यूज किए? एंड mind you, it doesn't end at these 8 terms. It can go beyond these 8 terms because the definition is very wide. It says includes. So sale will include wherein transfer of goods is happening. Transfer is wherein only the right to use has been transferred. Barter could be wherein one thing is given for in lieu of the other thing. For example, if if I am an auditor of a company, and instead of giving me the audit fees, the company has given me shares. So what will this be? This will be a barter transaction. Exchange, wherein I exchange my old thing with a new one along with some monetary consideration. Or if I give a license of any intellectual property rights, or I give my land on rental, all these transactions have been covered under supply. Now, the question arises, what do I mean by the term consideration and business? So the definition of consideration is given in section 2, subclause 31, which means consideration in relation to supply of goods or both includes, again it is an illustrative definition, which says अगर कोई पेमेंट किया जा रहा है या अग्री किया जा रहा है टू बी मेड, whether in money or otherwise, in respect or in response or inducement of supply of goods or services or both, this payment could be made by the recipient or any person on his behalf. So see, there has to be payment in money or in any other non-monetary form, which should be for the supply of goods or services and is to be made by the recipient or any other person on his behalf. But it shall not include any subsidy given by central government or state government. अगर कोई subsidy आती है central government या state government से, so that will not be a part of consideration. It also, consideration also states that any monetary value of any act or forbearance in respect of supply given by recipient or any other person, but shall not include subsidy. So let's assume that there is a construction going on in the vicinity, and because of that construction, there is a lot of problem or a lot of sound which is happening. So the builder comes up to me and says that he'll pay a monetary value for the forbearance of that or for tolerating the noise which is happening. So even this kind of a transaction will be treated as consideration. There is a proviso to this definition which says that अगर कोई deposit दिया गया है, so per se it will not be treated as consideration until and unless it is applied towards consideration of the said supply. For example, I have a commercial property. I have given it out on rent. Let's assume that the rent is 50,000 and the deposit that I have taken is, let's say, 6 months rental. So 50,000 is the monthly rental and 3 lakh rupees is the deposit that I have taken. Now, what is the consideration for my service? It will be 50,000, which is towards the supply. Now, will the deposit also be treated as consideration for the supply? Answer is no. Till the time I apply it towards the supply. So for assuming that the tenant has stopped paying the rental and he has said that आप जो भी rental है वो मेरे deposit में से ले लो. So now when I apportion the deposit towards the rental, that is the time when it will be treated as consideration. Only taking of deposit will not make it a consideration. So this is what do you mean by the term consideration. Now, the next question which is there is, okay, what do I mean by the term business, sir? So business is defined under section 217 of the CGST Act. Before dwelling into 217, I have some questions in relation to consideration. Will these transactions be treated as consideration? So CBIC White Circular number 178 has clarified some transactions. First such transaction is liquidated damages claimed for breach of contract. So there was a contract and in the contract there was some clause in relation to liquidated damages. So if any party to the contract makes a breach, there'll be some damages, liquidated damages, which are paid to be uh, paid by the party who is making a breach to the aggrieved party. Will this transaction be taxable under GST? So the amount which I have collected is towards penalty and not towards consideration. So therefore, any liquidated damages which are there are not consideration. I am not giving him right to do a breach. It is merely because I have suffered a breach, I am being compensated. So that is not chargeable to tax. Similarly, there are cases wherein there are some forfeiture which are made from the salary. Let's assume a person wants to leave the organization and he has to serve a notice period of, let's say, 2 months. Now the person goes to his employer and says that I don't want to continue and I'm not serving the notice period. So the employer says that the salary would be forfeited as the notice period is not being served. So will this forfeiture of salary be chargeable to tax? So the circular says, as the amount which has been recovered by the employer is not a consideration for tolerating his act, but is a penalty for dissuading the non-serious employees from taking employment and discouraging such situation. So this being in a penal nature, it is not to be charged to GST as it is not a consideration for supply. Then next example which they have taken in the circular pertains to late payment or surcharge or fees which are charged. For example, I have supplied goods to a party and the party has delayed the payment. So I had a clause in the agreement or in the invoice saying that if the delay is more than, let's say, 3 months, there'll be an interest which will be levied at, let's say, 18% per annum. Now, this interest which I am charging, will this be charged to GST? So, the circular clarifies that it will be treated as a composite supply and whatever tax has been charged on the main supply will be taxable. The late fee or the interest will also be taxed at the same rate. Similarly, check dishonor or penalties which are charged are not liable to GST because it is a penalty which has been taken and it is not in toleration of an act of dishonoring of check. So this is what has been clarified in circular number 178. Now let's take a case study wherein there is a donor who donates some amount to charitable institution. Will this activity be chargeable to GST? So, friends, any kind of donation which is given is without any expectation. There is no quid pro quo. So, that is the reason donations will not be chargeable to GST, because there is no consideration, no supply in return which the donor is receiving. Similarly, and this fact has been clarified in circular number 116 oblique 35 oblique 2019 of the circular. Later, if artwork is sent by an artist to the art exhibition or a gallery, will this transaction be taxed? So, if you see, merely sending of any artwork for exhibition, there is no supply per se. It is only for the purpose of exhibition that I have sent the goods. Once the goods have been sold at the exhibition, it will be treated as supply. But the act of only sending the goods will not be supply and will not be chargeable to GST. Again, this has been clarified by circular 22 of 2017. Now, coming to the definition of business, what do I mean by business? So, business has been defined very extensively under GST. Business includes any trade, commerce, manufacture, profession, vocation, adventure, wager, or any other similar activity, whether or not it is done for pecuniary benefit. So, if I do any activity without an intent of getting any profit out of it, it will still be treated as business. Let's say, take an example. Mr. A.R. Rahman plans to take a concert in Pune. ठीक है और जो भी पैसा इस कॉन्सर्ट से आएगा he will donate it to a charitable organization. So if you see the act of taking a concert with there is no intention to make a profit out of it. So will this transaction be still treated as business or will this activity be treated as business? The answer is yes, because it says any trade commerce activity or similar activity which is done without any profit motive, with or without profit motive, it will still be a business. Similarly, the subclause B says that any activity, transaction in connection to or incidental or ancillary to subclause A will also be treated as business. Let's assume that I am running a sugarcane factory. Okay? So what I am running a sugar factory. The activity which is being taking place is the sugarcane has been crushed for manufacturing of sugar. In the activity, there is some molasses which has been generated. Now, this molasses which has been generated is sold in the open market. So, if you see, my actual activity is what? Manufacture of sugar and selling of sugar. But am I involved in manufacturing of molasses? The answer is no. But because this activity is incidental and or ancillary to the main activity, it will still be treated as business. Further, under subclause C, the business definition says that if any activity does not have any volume, frequency, or continuity, still that transaction will be treated as business. So, volume, frequency, continuity is not relevant. So, let's assume that molasses are sold only once in a year. Okay? And it is a very minor part of my sales. Still, it will be treated as business. Going ahead, business definition also includes any activity of acquisition of goods, including capital goods or services for the commencement or closure of business. So if I want to commence my business, I am taking any services or capital goods, even that will be for the purpose of business. If I am closing down my business and selling the capital goods or my in goods, it will also be treated as business. Then any transaction between club and its members will be business. If I am giving admission at an payment of consideration, will also be treated as business. Then services of race clubs. Then a person who's holding an office and the services supplied by him will also be treated as business. The last one is very interesting. Any activity or transactions undertaken by central government or state government or local authority in which they are engaged as public authority is also treated as business. So government doing public authority functions have also been included in the definition of business. So if you see, the definition of business is very wide and it covers almost each and every transaction which we can think of. Now, we'll take a case study. It says there is Mr. Weber who sold his used car, which he was using for his personal commutation. Now, the sale of this car, will it also be treated as a business transaction? So, if you see, the car was for his personal commutation. Okay? So, do I take it into business? So, simple answer over here is it will not be treated as business. The reason being, it is an household transaction or it is a personal transaction and not a business transaction. Similar view was taken in the CBIC circular where it was held that when gold ornaments are given for money or in exchange of new gold, it will not be treated as supply by the household entity. Similarly, in this current situation, because this being a personal transaction, there will be no uh, it will not be treated as supply in the course or furtherance of business. Let's assume Mr. Weber was engaged in the business of uh, running a driving school, and now the used vehicle which he has, he wants to sell it off. Will this transaction be a supply? Or will this transaction be in the course or furtherance of business? The answer is yes, because this is a business asset which is transferring and not a personal asset. Okay. Now moving to the next part of it. So if we see, to recall, we have concluded with the general supply definition. General supply definition is very easy. It says any of the eight transactions done for a consideration between persons in the course or furtherance of business will be a supply. Next transaction which is stated in the supply definition is pertaining to AOP BOI giving services to its members. So now the it says the activities or transactions by a person other than an individual to its members or constituents or vice versa for cash or deferred payments or other valuable consideration. I'll give you a context behind it. So before this point or before this being added into the definition of supply, there was something called as principle of mutuality. Principle of mutuality means a person cannot earn income from himself. So one cannot earn income from himself. So if you see the let's take an example of a resident welfare association which is there. Okay? It is giving services of maintenance of the property to its members. So, will this transaction be chargeable to taxes or will this qualify to be a supply? So, earlier it was not covered because it was covered by the principle of mutuality, wherein one person cannot give services to himself or supply goods or services to himself. This same view was taken in the case of State of West Bengal versus Calcutta Club by the Apex Court, wherein it was held that any service, in case of service tax, it was held that any service fees charged by the club from its members for services provided to its members will not be chargeable to service tax. And similar analogy could be drawn into GST as well. But by inserting this, the government has created a deeming fiction and has stated that in the explanation, it says that for the purpose of this clause, it is hereby clarified that notwithstanding anything contained in any other law, so it has an overriding effect to any other law for the time being in force or any judgment, decree, or any order of the court. The person and its members or constituents shall be deemed to be two separate persons, and supply or activities or transaction between these two persons will be deemed to take place between two separate persons. Now, to give a overview of this, in GST also, this particular provision was challenged in the case of Indian Medical Association, and Kerala High Court affirmed the principle of mutuality and struck and told to struck down this particular section. But the department is filed an SLP before the Supreme Court, and the matter is again sub judice till date. So until and unless this particular point attains finality, for the time being, it is to be treated that when any activity is done by members or by the members to the club, it will be treated as a supply between two separate person, and there will be a supply transaction, and therefore GST could be chargeable. So until and unless this matter has been finally been decided by the Supreme Court, we have to treat it as supply because it has been there in the law and it is still not been removed. Next transaction which is there is import of services for a consideration, whether or not in the course of furtherance of business, will be treated as supply. So if I import any services for a consideration, even if it is not for business, it will be treated as supply within the definition of section 7 clause B. Section 7 subsection 1 clause B. Now, what do I mean by the term import of service? Is this term defined anywhere? So section 2 subclause 11 of the IGST Act defines import of services as means the supply of any service where supplier of service should be located outside India, recipient of service is located in India, and place of supply should be in India. So supplier is outside India, recipient is in India, and the place of supply is in India. It will be treated as import of service. Any import of service transaction made for a consideration, even if it is not in the course of furtherance of business, it will be treated as business. So till now we have covered three things in the inclusion of supply definition. One is the general supply, which is 8 forms of supply made for a consideration between two persons in the course of furtherance of business. Then we have seen a transaction between AOP or BOI to its members or vice versa. Third transaction which is there is import of service for a consideration, even if it is not for business, it will be treated as supply. The last item that is in the inclusion is any activity which is specified in Schedule 1, even if it is not for a consideration, will be treated as supply. So, Schedule 1 of the CGST Act talks about the deemed supply thing. So, Schedule 1 will refer to Schedule 1. Schedule 1 has 4 entries in it. First entry talks about any prime. So, Schedule 1 is the activities or activities to be treated as supply even if it is made without consideration. So the first item in it is permanent transfer or disposal of business asset where input tax credit has been availed on such assets. So any business asset which is transferred and the input tax credit was availed, even if this transaction is without consideration, will be treated as supply. So let's assume that I have old computers at my office. Now I am want to discard it. So I give it to a let's say a charitable organization without any consideration. So will this transaction be a supply? So answer is yes, even if it is not covered under 71A. But because 71C read with Schedule 1 states that transaction wherein a disposal of business asset on which input tax credit was availed has been transferred will still be covered even if there is no consideration. Next point talks about any goods or services between related person or a distinct person when made in course or furtherance of business will be supply even if there is no consideration. So the term related person has been defined in section 15, that is valuation rule, valuation section, and distinct person has been defined in section 25. So if you are either related party or a distinct person, and if any transaction happens between distinct person in relation to goods or services, even if there is no consideration, it will still be treated as furtherance of business. So I'll take an example of distinct person. Distinct person will mean I have a registration in Pune and I have a registration in, let's say, Delhi. Because GST registration is required on state basis. So I have taken two registrations on the same PAN, one in Pune, that is in Maharashtra, and one in Delhi. Excuse me. So now both these entities, in the eyes of GST law, it is distinct persons. So it is treated as distinct person. So any transaction happening between these two entities will even if without consideration, will be treated as supply. So for example, if stock is transferred from Delhi branch to Pune branch, it will still be treated as supply even if there is no consideration, and the tax will have to be paid. Now, there is a proviso to this particular entry which says, provided that gifts not exceeding rupees 50,000 rupees in value in a financial year by any employer to employee shall not be treated as supply of goods or services or both. So, employer and employee are considered as related person within the definition of related person which is mentioned in section 15. Now, if employer gives any gift to employee for the monetary value not exceeding rupees 50,000, it will not be covered under Schedule 1. But if the value exceeds rupees 50,000, it will be covered under Schedule 1, because even if there is no consideration, it will be treated as supply. Next entry which talks about deemed consideration, deemed supply is supply of goods between principal to agent or agent to principal. Even if there is no consideration, it will still be treated as supply. And last is import of services by a person from his related person or any other establishment outside India in the course or furtherance of business. Sir, I have a doubt. Import of service has already been taken up under 7(1)(b). Then why do I have again in Schedule 1? So if you read this entry, it says import of service for a consideration whether or not in business. So if it is for a consideration and not for business, still it will be supplied under 7(1)(b). Whereas import of service referred in Schedule 1, there should not be consideration, and it should be in the course or furtherance of business, and then and only then it will be covered by Schedule 1. So there is difference. First one which was there was a consideration, but it was not in the course of business. The item which is mentioned in Schedule 1 says that it should be for business, but there is no consideration. So in that case, import of service from a person who is related or an other establishment outside India will also be treated as supply. So this is in relation to your Schedule 1. So now we've covered all the parts of the inclusion of the supply. Moving to the second limb of what are to be excluded. Before we move to that, I have a few queries which I want to ask. Whether this particular transaction will be treated as supply or not. So we have Mr. Ram who is retiring from his company. Okay? And as a token of appreciation, the company gave him the laptop and car which he used during the course of his service without any consideration being charged. Will this transaction be treated as supply? So 7(1)(a), which is general supply, says that there should be a 8-item supply, that is sale, transfer, barter, lease, license, rental, made between persons for a consideration in the course or furtherance of business. Because here there is no consideration, it will not fall under 7(1)(a). 7(1)(a) is specifically for AOP BOIs giving services to its members. Then 7(1)(c) was for import of service. Again, we are not covered by 7(1)(c). 7(1)(d), which is there. Sorry, 7(1)(b) was related to import of service. 7(1)(c) talks about deemed supplies wherein there is no consideration. Schedule 1 item. So Schedule 1 item wherein first was, if any business asset is transferred on which input tax credit was availed and has been transferred without consideration, it will still be treated as supply. So if you see, laptop which is given and car which are given without consideration. So now, was ITC availed on this business asset? So laptop pe to asset, business asset and ITC was availed because it is not block credit. Whereas in case of car, because ITC was not availed, it will not fall under para 1 of the Schedule 1. So laptop is taxable. Now for car, if you read entry number 2, if there is any supply of goods or services between related person and the value is more than 50,000, it will be treated as supply. So now the employer gave the employee a car on which ITC was not availed. But because this gift exceeds value of rupees 50,000, deeming fiction will come into play and it will be treated as supply. So supply में कौन कौन सा आएगा? लैपटॉप भी आएगा and कार भी आ जाएगा. Now, once I have classified a transaction to be supply, then as we discussed, there could be a problem wherein what should I classify this supply? Whether I should classify it as a supply of goods or supply of service will be determined by section 7(1) capital A. So section 7(1) capital A says that where a certain activities or transaction constitute a supply in accordance with the provisions of subsection 1, they shall be treated as either a supply of goods or supply of service as referred to in schedule 2. तो schedule 2 अगर उसको goods बोल रहा है तो उसको goods मान के टैक्स किया जाएगा, अगर शेड्यूल 2 उसको सर्विस बोल रहा है तो सर्विस बोल के टैक्स किया जाएगा. नाउ इट इज एन इंटरेस्टिंग फैक्ट that 7(1)(a) is only for the sole purpose of determining the classification. Merely because an item is mentioned in schedule 2 will not trigger supply. तो सिर्फ शेड्यूल 2 में मेंशन है बोल के वो सप्लाई नहीं हो जाएगी. सप्लाई आपको 7(1) में ही डिटरमाइन करनी है. सप्लाई किस चीज की है, गुड्स की है या सर्विस की है, ये कहां से डिटरमाइन होगा, ये 7(1)(a) से डिटरमाइन होगा. आई होप आई एम क्लियर. नाउ what is schedule 2? So schedule 2 states that activities or transactions to be treated as supply of goods or supply of services. So first item which is mentioned in schedule 2 is in relation to transfer. Any transfer wherein title of goods are being transferred, तो क्या ट्रांसफर हो रहा है, गुड्स ट्रांसफर हो रहे हैं, तो इट विल बी ट्रीटेड एज सप्लाई ऑफ गुड्स. Any transfer wherein the right of goods or an undivided share in goods without the transfer of title is being given, it will be supply of service. Let's assume कि मेरे पास फॉर एग्जाम्पल हम लोग गोवा जाते हैं, राइट. गोवा जाते हैं तो हम लोग गाड़ी व्हीकल्स रेंट पे लेते हैं. अब जब मैं व्हीकल रेंट पे ले रहा हूं, व्हाट एम आई टेकिंग, आई एम टेकिंग राइट एंड गुड्स, दैट इज राइट टू यूज. ठीक है. इज द ट्रांस टाइटल बीइंग ट्रांसफर्ड टू मी, आंसर इज नो. तो अगर टाइटल ट्रांसफर हो जाएगा तो सप्लाई ऑफ गुड्स हो जाएगा. अगर टाइटल नहीं ट्रांसफर हो रहा है, ओनली राइट इज बीइंग ट्रांसफर्ड, देन इट विल बी अ सप्लाई ऑफ सर्विस. ठीक है. Similarly, third part which is there, C part says that any transfer of title in goods, यहाँ पे क्या ट्रांसफर हो रहा है, टाइटल ही ट्रांसफर हो रहा है, बट कब ट्रांसफर होगा, on a future date upon payment of full consideration. For example, I have purchased a vehicle on hire purchase. ठीक है. हायर परचेज पे मैंने कोई गाड़ी खरीदी है, इसका ट्रांसफर ऑफ टाइटल कब होगा, जब मैं फाइनल पेमेंट कर दूंगा, फुल एंड फाइनल लास्ट इंस्टॉलमेंट जब पे हो जाएगा, देन आई विल रिसीव द टाइटल इन गुड्स. ठीक है. Still, if the title in goods is being transferred, it will be treated as supply of goods and not a supply of service. So, to distinguish, if transfer pertains to title, it will be supply of goods. If transfer pertains to only use or right to use or any other right, it will be supply of service. So, शेड्यूल 2 बता रहा है कि ट्रांसफर के केस में उसको गुड्स कब बोलेंगे एंड सर्विस कब बोलेंगे. सिमिलरली, अगर कोई लैंड एंड बिल्डिंग लीज या टेनेंसी ईजमेंट लाइसेंस टू ऑक्यूपाई लैंड दिया जा रहा है, इट विल बी ट्रीटेड एज सप्लाई ऑफ सर्विस बिकॉज हियर व्हाट इज बीइंग गिवन इज राइट टू यूज. ठीक है. Then lease or letting out or for building, including a commercial, industrial or residential complex for business or commerce, either wholly or in part, it will be treated as supply of service. So अगर कोई land दी जा रही है या building दी जा रही है for rental, it will be what? It will be a supply of service. Now, if I've entered into a long-term lease with a person for giving, let's say the long term lease is for 10 years. ठीक है. 10 years के लिए I have given the lease for occupying this building. What will this be? It will be a supply of service. Now next point is treatment or process. Any treatment or process which is applied on any other person's goods, मतलब goods का ownership मेरे पास है क्या, answer is no. I am only doing what, any process or treatment, it will be a supply of service and not a supply of goods. So friends, let's assume that Levi's sending its jeans for washing, या फिर उसके ऊपर वो जो टोन किया जाता है जीन्स को, इसके लिए किसी और थर्ड पार्टी जॉब वर्कर के पास अगर गुड्स भेजे जा रहे हैं, तो इसको क्या बोला जाएगा, इट विल बी ट्रीटेड एज सप्लाई ऑफ सर्विस. नेक्स्ट इज व्हेन ट्रांसफर ऑफ बिजनेस एसेट इज हैपनिंग. When any goods which forms part of an asset of business are transferred or disposed of by or under the direction of person carrying on business so as no longer forming part of the assets, such transfer or disposal will be treated as supply of goods. यहाँ पे अगर आप देखेंगे तो टाइटल या गुड्स ट्रांसफर ही कर दिए जा रहे हैं, यहाँ पे कुछ राइट नहीं दिया जा रहा है टू यूज, द एंटायर गुड्स आर बीइंग गिवन और disposed, it will be treated as supply of goods. Whenever under a direction of a person carrying on the business, goods held or used for the purpose of business are put to private use. For example, vehicle of the business is being used by the managing director for his private use. ठीक है, what will this be? It will be a supply of service. तो या तो कोई खुद प्राइवेट यूज कर रहा है या किसी और को प्राइवेट यूज के लिए या यूज के लिए अवेलेबल करके दिया जा रहा है गुड्स, then it will be a supply of service. Excuse me. Moving to the next point, when a person ceases to be a taxable person, अब वो उसका क्योंकि टर्नओवर लेट्स से below 20 lakhs है, for let's assume that he is a supplier of goods as well as services, तो उसका लिमिट कितना है 20 lakhs for the purpose of registration. Now if he ceases because his turnover has fallen below rupees 20 lakhs and he wants to surrender his registration, so now because the turnover has been below the threshold limit and he is no more a taxable person, then all the goods which were forming part of his assets when he was carrying out of the business shall be deemed to be supplied. यहाँ पे क्या बोल रहा है, डीमिंग फिक्शन ला दिया जा रहा है कि इट विल बी डीम्ड टू बी सप्लाइड, ठीक है, एंड देयरफॉर इट विल बी अ सप्लाई ऑफ service, supply of goods. And there are two more situations which are mentioned by him in if the business immediately before he ceases to be a taxable person, unless business is transferred as a going concern and business is carried on by a personal representative. So अगर मैं सीज कर रहा हूं, ठीक है, except for these two situations it will be transfer of assets, मतलब गुड्स का सप्लाई होगा. बट ये दो चीजें जब हो जाएगी तब इस पर्टिकुलर ट्रांसफर ऑफ बिजनेस एसेट्स में वो फॉल नहीं करेगा. सो व्हेन अ बिजनेस इज ट्रांसफर्ड एज अ गोइंग कंसर्न इट विल बी ट्रीटेड एज अ सप्लाई ऑफ सर्विस, although not written here, but because it is not covered, it will be a supply of service. Similarly, supply of service being in the nature of renting of an immovable property will be treated as supply of service. Construction of a complex building or civil structure or a part thereof, including a complex or building intended for sale to a buyer wholly or partly, except where the entire consideration has been received after issuance of completion certificate, where required by the competent authority or after its first occupation, whichever is earlier, will be treated as supply of service. For example, I give my ready property on rental, it will be what? Supply of service. If I am constructing a building, ठीक है, if a builder is constructing a building and in that building which is being constructed a person books a unit, ठीक है, it will also be treated as supply of service, provided the booking amount or any part of the consideration should be received before the building being completed or before it is first occupation. ठीक है, अगर ये होता है then and only then it will be treated as supply of service. The last, so in 5 we have covered A, B, then C talks about any temporary transfer or permitting use of intellectual property rights will also be treated as supply of service. So let's assume I have any intellectual property rights and I give that intellectual property right for use. So what will it be? A supply of service. If a person is giving services of development, design, programming, or customization of a software, it will be a supply of service. Then, if any person agrees to do an act or tolerate an act or refrain from an act, it will be treated as a supply of service. For example, I have entered into a non-compete agreement with, let's say, a person. Let's say Haldiram enters into an non-compete agreement with Bikaji, saying that for northern India only Haldiram is supposed to supply goods or their namkeens over there. This particular transaction, which this is what? This is an category of item which will fall under E, and it will be treated as supply of service. This non-compete agreement which we have entered between Haldiram and Bikaji, it will be a supply of service. Later, if transfer or right to use any goods has been transferred for a specified period or not, it will also be treated as supply of service. So last entry of Schedule 2 is composite supply, wherein works contract is involved. Both goods as well as services are involved. It will be treated as supply of service. Any restaurant services, wherein service is also there and food is also being served, it will be treated as supply of services. So, Schedule 2 basically gives the classification when a transaction is to be treated as goods, when a transaction is to be treated as services. Now that we have covered the inclusions, we have talked about the classification, we come to 7.2, which talks about transactions which are not to be treated as supply. So, notwithstanding anything contained in subsection 1. So, notwithstanding means it is overriding subsection 1. A, activities or transactions specified in schedule 3. Schedule 3 में जो भी activities mentioned होंगे उसको हम supply treat नहीं करेंगे. And B says that activities or transactions undertaken by central government, state government, or local authority in which they are engaged as public authorities as may be notified by the government on recommendation of council shall be treated neither as supply of goods nor supply of services. Sir, 7 to B डालने की क्या जरूरत आई? So if you remember, we have seen the definition of business. Under business, they say that any activities undertaken by central government, state government, or local authority where they are engaged as public authority will also be treated as business. So देखिए, अगर हम supply का definition पढ़े 7.1a में, it says about the 8 forms of supply, plus there should be a consideration, it should be between persons, and it should be in the course or furtherance of business. So देयर इज 8 फॉर्म्स ऑफ सप्लाई में से कुछ ना कुछ हो रहा है, लेट्स अज्यूम. ठीक है, कंसिडरेशन भी है. ठीक है, इट इज बिटवीन पर्सन्स आल्सो, बट it is a business. So because it is covered under section 217 of the definition of business, it is business. So because it is class fulfilling all the conditions which are there under 7.1a, this particular transaction was getting covered under supply and it was being taxable under GST. So to put it outside the ambit of GST, what they have done is any activities wherein central government, state government, or local authority is engaged as a public authority and has been notified by the government. So notification has to be issued by the government on the recommendation of council. Then and only then it will not be treated as goods or supply of service. Okay. Now coming to schedule 3. तो ये दो चीजें बाहर हो जाएगी फ्रॉम सप्लाई. नाउ व्हाट इज शेड्यूल 3? शेड्यूल 3 कवर्स 10 आइटम्स. ठीक है. So these particular items will not be treated as supply. First one is services by an employee. Services by an employee to employer in the course or in relation to his employment will be outside the ambit of GST. तो अगर कोई employee employer को service दे रहा है, it is not covered under supply. I have a question over here. Let's assume that the employer is giving the transportation facility to employee. Will this particular transaction be covered under Schedule 3? My question is very clear. There is an employee, there is an employer. The employer gives transportation facility to the employee. Will this particular service be outside the ambit of GST under Schedule 3? So, friends, the answer is no, because what is outside the ambit of supply is services by employee to employer. The services by employer to employee are not covered here. So therefore, any transaction wherein employer is giving services to employee, it will not fall under Schedule 3. Sir, but what can be done to get it outside the ambit of Schedule 3. So what could be done is, whenever the employment agreement is drafted between the employee and employer, such items such as food facility or the transportation facility should be shown as an perquisite. So it will fall outside the ambit of GST and it will not be covered under supply. So for the time being, let's not get into it. We are talking about services by employee to employer in the course or in relation to employment will not be covered under the supply as it is falling within Schedule 3. Any services which in court or tribunal established under any law for the time being force has provided, it is also covered by Schedule 3. So court providing services will not be under the definition of supply and will not be chargeable to GST. Next, then the functions performed by members of parliament, members of state legislature, members of panchayat, members of municipality or local any other local authority will also be outside the ambit of supply. The duties performed by any person who holds any post in pursuance of the provisions of the constitution in that capacity will also be outside the supply. The duties performed by any person as a chairman, member, director in a body established by central government, state government, or local authority, and who is not deemed as an employee, but not deemed as an employee before the commencement of this clause, will also be outside the ambit of supply. Services of funeral, burial, crematorium, or mortuary, including transportation of deceased, will be outside the scope of supply. Any sale of land, mind you, sale of land and subject to clause B, paragraph 5 of schedule 2, sale of building. So sale of land and sale of building after completion of after receive of completion certificate are outside the scope of supply. So अगर कोई land बेच रहा है, it will not be covered under GST. There will be no supply. If a person is selling a building after completion, it will also be outside the ambit of GST as it is covered under Schedule 3. Then we have actionable claims. So if you remember when we discussed the definition of goods, goods means any movable property but does not includes money and security, but includes what? But includes actionable claim. So actionable claims is goods, but because it is covered by Schedule 3, it is not within the supply. So it is outside the ambit of supply, or you can call it out of the scope of supply. Comma, other than specified actionable claims. तो वैसे तो actionable claims नहीं है covered, but specified actionable claims अगर है, तो it will be treated as supply. What are these specified actionable claims? Specified actionable claims are betting, casino, gambling, horse racing, lottery और online money gaming. अगर इनमें से कोई activity है, तो it will be covered within the definition of supply. Other than this, actionable claims which are there will not be covered because it is mentioned in the schedule 3. Then let's assume a transaction of supply of goods is happening from a place in the non-taxable territory to another place in non-taxable territory without such goods entering into India. So assuming a person sitting in India buys goods from China, supplies goods to USA, will this transaction be covered within the scope of supply? Answer is no, because the goods have never come into India. For any transaction to be taxed, it has to be within the territory of taxable territory, which is India. So if it is outside the taxable territory, it is not taxable as it is covered under Schedule 3. Similarly, if warehoused goods are supplied before clearance for home consumption, so many goods import kiye, these goods have been warehoused and till date we have not filed a bill of entry for home consumption. And before that, if I sell it, it will be outside the scope of supply. This transaction will not be chargeable to supply GST. Similarly, supply of warehouse goods in CEZ or free trade warehousing zones to any person before clearance for export or for domestic or to the domestic tariff area. So अगर warehouse goods in SEZ और free trade warehousing zone में है and अगर वो पहले ही बेचे जा चुके हैं before clearing for export या फिर DTA में ट्रांसफर करने से पहले, So again, these are outside the scope of GST because it is not covered under the supply definition. It is covered under Schedule 3. So supply of goods by the consignee, the person who has ordered the goods, has supplied the goods by endorsement of the documents of title of goods after the goods have been dispatched, but before the goods have reached the port of origin located outside. So it has been dispatched from the port of origin located outside, but before clearing it for home consumption, I have sold it. So will this transaction be covered under supply? Answer is no. Then these particular two entries have now been inserted for the purpose of insurance sector. So wherein there is a co-insurance premium has been charged, and lead insurer and co-insurer are jointly supplying the are cumulatively providing the insurance service. If the lead insurer has paid the GST on the entire premium amount, then again GST is not to be charged. So these are the activities which are covered under Schedule 3. Now, so if you see, for a transaction to be taxed, there has to be goods or services. So either it should fall under the definition of goods or services. Then there has to be a supply. And after there is a supply, we have to check whether there is a levy on those particular goods. If all these three conditions have been satisfied, then and only then I can say that GST is applicable. Now, with the background that we have read so far, I have a question. Whether alcoholic liquor for human consumption be chargeable to GST with the background that we have seen so far. So if we see whether it is goods or services, it is covered under goods because it is a movable property. It is not excluded. Alcoholic liquor is not excluded from the definition of goods. Whether there is supply, sale, transfer, barter, lease, license for a consideration between persons in the course or furtherance of business. So because that condition of 7(1) is satisfied, so it is a supply. So two elements are there. Goods भी है, goods और services में एक है, and supply भी हो रहा है. So GST should be levied. But the determination whether GST is to be levied or not will be done through levy. So section 9 of the GST Act talks about levy. Before going into the levy portion, I have certain things to be discussed. So for a transaction to be taxed, there are two nature of supplies which are there. One is intrastate supply, the other one is interstate supply. Intrastate supply का मतलब होता है when the supply happens within the same state or the union territory. ठीक है? For example, if goods are being supplied or services are being supplied within Maharashtra, it will be treated as intrastate supply. ठीक है? When two separate states or a state and an union territory are involved, it will be treated as an interstate transaction. So in case of intra, CGST, SGST to be levied. In case of interstate transaction, IGST is to be levied. Now on the nature of supply, we are clear there are two types of supply. One is intra, the other one is inter. On the basis of taxability, there are types of supplies which are there. One is non-taxable supply. Then we have exempt supply. Then we have taxable supply and zero rated supply. Firstly, what do I mean by non-taxable supply? So non-taxable supply has been defined under GST under section 2, subclause 78, which starts with the word means, meaning it is an exhaustive definition. Non-taxable supply means a supply which is not taxable, yeah, which is not liable to tax under this act meaning the CGST Act or under the IGST Act. So any supply which is not liable to tax under CGST or SGST will be treated as non-taxable supplies. What do I mean by exempt supplies? Exempt supply again starts with the word means, which means it is an exhaustive definition, which says that supply of goods or services or both which attract nil rate of tax, जिसका rate of tax is 0%, or which may be wholly exempt from tax under section 11 or section 6 of the IGST Act. Section 11 and section 6 provides for the exemptions and includes non-taxable supply. मतलब अगर आप exempt supply की बात करोगे तो exempt supply includes three things. One is nil rated, the other one is wholly exempt, and the third one is non-taxable supply. So even non-taxable supplies is included in exempt supplies. So the term exempt supply is very wide per se. Now, what do I mean by the word taxable supplies? Taxable supplies is the opposite of non-taxable supplies. So taxable supplies means a supply which is leviable to tax. Here it was not leviable, here it is leviable to tax under this act or under the IGST Act. So any supply which is leviable to tax will be called as taxable supplies. Now, we've talked about non-taxable supplies. We have talked about taxable supplies. We have talked about exempt supplies. There is a transaction which is called as zero rated supplies. Mind you, these all things that we had discussed were pertaining to supply, okay? Wherein zero rated supply is a transaction which is not taxed. Okay? Zero rated supply means any of the following supply, namely export of goods or services or both, or supply of goods or services to cess. So when I am making any supplies to export or to cess, it will be zero rated supply. Zero rated supply का मतलब ये नहीं है कि उस supply का rate zero है. Zero rated supply means it has been given the benefit of zero rating under section 16(1) of the IGST Act, when provided it is covered by two transaction, export or supply to SEZ unit. SEZ is nothing but your special economic zone. So this nil rate and zero rate are different. Nil rate is wherein the rate is zero, whereas zero rated is wherein the transaction has a rate of tax, but because it is being exported or because it is being supplied to SEZ unit, it is covered under zero rating. Now that we have seen types of supply, nature of supply, now we'll delve into levy. So levy and collection has been provided. So we can call it as the charging section also. The charging section under CGST Act is section 9 and under the IGST Act is section 5. So levy section says that subject to subsection 2, a levy of CGST will be made on the value of supply. Okay? At a rate which is notified by the government not exceeding 20%. ठीक है, ये सेक्शन 9 सबसेक्शन 1 में मेंशन्ड है. Section 9(1) says that levy will be there, but it will not be there on alcoholic liquor. So 9(1) specifically excludes alcoholic liquor. So अभी तक हमने जब पढ़ा था तो गुड्स में आ रहा था कि alcoholic liquor. Yes, answer is yes. Sir, whether there was a supply, yes, it was a supply, but because there is no levy under section 9, that is the reason there is no GST which is being levied. ठीक है, on alcoholic liquor. Similarly, subsection 2 says that for 5 petro products, that is crude oil, high speed diesel, motor spirit, aviation turbine fuel and natural gas, when these items are being supplied, the GST is to be levied from a date to be notified. आज के डेट पे GST लेवी होगा क्या? आंसर इज नो. फ्यूचर में GST लगाया जा सकता है क्या? यस, फ्रॉम अ डेट टू बी नोटिफाइड बाय द गवर्नमेंट. So until and unless it is not notified, till then 5 पेट्रो प्रोडक्ट्स पे GST का लेवी आ सकता है क्या? आंसर इज नो. सो when we talk about non-taxable supplies, means a supply which is not leviable to tax. What is not leviable to tax? Two things are not leviable: alcoholic liquor for human consumption and 5 petro products. When any transaction is for these two items, it will be covered under non-taxable supply. Then section 9 also talks about some certain goods and services wherein the notified goods and services wherein the supplier is not liable to pay tax, but the recipient is liable to pay tax. In case of URD RCM, wherein some inward supplies are taken from an unregistered person by a class of registered person, then RCM would apply. And last one is, so first two sections will talk about forward charge. These two subsections talk about RCM, and last subsection talks about the liability to pay tax by the third person. So it is a unique case wherein the taxability on supply of goods or services is rendered on the third person being the e-commerce operator. We'll see all these items in detail in the next slide. So charging section under CGST is section 9, charging section under IGST is section 5. So charging section says that it is on supply of goods and goods or services. So IGST is also supply of goods or services other than alcoholic liquor for human consumption. So CGST cannot be levied on alcoholic liquor for human consumption. Similarly, IGST cannot be levied. CGST will be levied in case of intrastate supplies, whereas IGST will be levied on interstate supplies. And at what rate do I have to, or at what value do I have to charge tax? The value will be determined as per section 15 in both the cases. Now, CGST Act has also given a capping of the rate of tax which can be there. The rate of tax capped is at 20% under CGST because there, in case of intrastate, there are two tax which are to be levied. One is CGST and SGST. So 20% CGST will be the maximum rate, and similarly under SGST the maximum rate would be 20%. Whereas in case of IGST, the only difference which is there is it is levied on interstate supplies, and the maximum rate which is there is 40%, as only one tax is to be levied in case of interstate supplies, that is IGST. Now, this is very important. There are certain notifications which were issued in relation to goods and services giving the rate of tax at which the tax has to be levied. So, rate of tax for CGST Act in case of goods was given in the notification number 1 oblique 2017 of central tax rate. So notifications are of two types. One is the rate notification, the other one is general notification. Whenever there is any change in the taxability, it will be given by the rate notification. For example, if I want to give any exemption, if I want to bring any transaction into RCM, if I want to change the rate of tax, all this will be given through rate notification. Whereas if there is any procedural change which is to be happen, then that will be by normal notifications, which will be under the central tax or the integrated tax. So goods का जो मदर नोटिफिकेशन था for rate, it was 1/2017 of central tax rate. However, with effect from 22nd of September 2025, the rates of GST have gone a drastic change, and the earlier notification which was there has been superseded by the new notification which is 9/2025. So whenever any transaction which is after 22nd September 2025, we have to refer this notification to determine the rate at which the goods are to be taxed. Similarly, for services, the parent notification is 11/2017 of central tax rate. Easy to remember, goods के लिए 1, services के लिए 11. Under IGST goods के लिए it was 1/2017 of integrated rate, and similarly for with effect from 22nd September, the rates have been notified under 9/2025 of integrated rates. So the number is same, only the notification, this is under central tax, this is under integrated tax. So services के लिए the rate has been mentioned in notification number 8/2017 of integrated of the central tax rate. I mean the integrated tax rate. The notification here should ideally be integrated and not central tax. Okay. These are the important notification one should refer to when he is determining the rate at which the particular transaction is to be taxed. Now, the question arises, what is the difference between forward charge and reverse charge? Now, will the value of supply differ, or will there be any difference if a transaction is under RCM or under FCM? For example, if a product is, let's say, of a taxable value of 100 rupees, ठीक है, and उसके ऊपर tax is, let's say, 10%. So what will be the total value? 100 rupees taxable value, 10 rupees tax. The total value will be 110. Now, will this change if there is forward charge vis-a-vis RCM? So let's check. Forward charge mein there is a supplier who supplies goods or services by raising a tax invoice on the recipient. What the recipient would do is recipient will pay the tax invoice ka value along with the GST. So let's say he'll give the 110 rupees to the supplier. Now it is the duty of the supplier to pay the 10 rupees of GST to the government. This is nothing but your forward charge. But then there is RCM. In certain cases, that is notified goods or services, or in case of certain class of registered taxpayer, the RCM provisions are applicable, wherein supplier supplies goods to the recipient by raising an invoice. He'll not raise a tax invoice. What he'll do is he'll issue a invoice, which will be a commercial invoice. Recipient will make the payment of the commercial invoice excluding GST. मतलब कितने का पेमेंट करेगा रेसिपिएंट 100 रुपीज का पेमेंट करेगा. And now it is the responsibility of the recipient to pay 10 rupees of GST to the government. So this is nothing but your reverse charge. So whenever we are talking about forward charge, the supplier is responsible to pay the tax to the government, whereas in case of reverse charge, the recipient is responsible to pay tax to the government. This is the only difference. There will be no change in the total outflow of the recipient. इधर भी आउटफ्लो 110 रुपए ही था, 100 रुपए सप्लायर को जा रहा था, 10 रुपए गवर्नमेंट को जा रहा था. Similarly, in RCM also the same thing will happen. Only a procedural compliance will increase, that is payment of tax to the government. बाकी सब कुछ will remain the same. Moving to 9.5. This is an interesting point. 9.5 talks about notified services wherein neither the supplier nor the recipient will be liable to pay tax. It is the third person who is liable to pay tax to the government. So let's take an example of transportation of passenger wherein the recipient from his mobile application books a transportation of passenger service. Okay, he places an order and makes a payment to the e-commerce operator, that is Ola. Now, what Ola does is Ola sends this order details to the actual car driver or the supplier. Later, the service happens between the supplier and the recipient. So the supplier provides the services to the recipient. Now, in such a scenario, normally the supplier would have been liable to pay tax if it would have been FCM case. If it would have been reverse charge, the recipient would have been liable to pay. But this being a unique case, it is the third party, which is the e-commerce operator, that is Ola, will have to pay GST to the government. And mind you, this is only in case of notified services. There is only notified services wherein third party taxation would be triggered. These services are broadly four services. One is your transportation of passenger. Second one is accommodation services. Third is the housekeeping services. And fourth is your restaurant services. So I have given the companies which are engaged in this kind of services: Ola in case of transportation, Oyo in case of accommodation, Urban Clap in case of housekeeping, and Swiggy in case of restaurant services. Now we'll delve in detail as to what is 9.5. So 9.5 is services supplied through e-commerce operator. Whenever services, mind you, it is not talking about goods. Goods के case में ultimately it is the supplier only who has to pay the tax. But in case of services, that too notified, the e-commerce operator will have to pay tax, not the supplier, not the recipient. ठीक है? Now take an example wherein, because this person has no, the e-commerce operator who is there has no place of business in India. But because there is taxability under 9.5, he will have to appoint a representative in India for payment of tax. So if he is in India, he will pay. If he is not in India, he will have to appoint a representative. If he is not appointed a representative, he has to appoint a representative for making the compliance of section 9.5. Now, what are the services? Services are passenger transportation, restaurant services, accommodation services, and housekeeping services. In case of passenger transportation and restaurant services, it is always that e-commerce operator will pay. However, in case of accommodation services and housekeeping services, it is to be checked whether the supplier is liable to pay, sorry, whether the supplier is liable for registration under section 22. Section 22 says that when the threshold exceeds a certain limit, let's say 20 lakh rupees is the limit, if the threshold is exceeded, then it is the supplier has to take a registration. And in such cases, in case of accommodation and housekeeping services, the supplier will be liable even if he has supplied it through e-commerce operator. So friends, in case of accommodation housekeeping, you have to check whether the supplier is liable to get himself registered. If he is liable, then supplier is to pay the tax. If his turnover is below the threshold limit, then e-commerce operator will pay tax irrespective. That is accommodation and housekeeping. For passenger transportation restaurant, you don't have to see the turnover of supplier. It is always the e-commerce operator who has to pay the tax. Now we are done with the levy. So now we have covered goods and services. We have covered supply. We have covered the levy. And now we are moving towards a unique case wherein there is a composite or mixed supply. So what do you mean by composite supply? Composite supply is a supply where taxable person makes two or more taxable supplies of goods or services in combination to the recipient, out of which these supplies which are made are naturally bundled and are supplied in conjunction with each other. One of which, so two or more supplies are made, one of which should be principal supply. So friends, for anything to be a composite supply, those goods or services should be naturally bundled, and one of which should be a principal supply, then and only then it will fall under the ambit of composite supply. Take an example. I am supplying goods. ठीक है? For supplying goods, what I am doing is I am taking insurance, I am I am packing the goods and also doing transportation of these goods to make the goods available to the recipient. So now if you see, there are goods which is, there is a taxable supply of goods, there is taxable services of transportation, insurance and packing material which is there. Now, what will it be? Will it be a composite supply? Answer is yes, because the principal supply over here is in relation to supply of goods. So principal supply means the predominant element of the composite supply. So whatever is the predominant element will be your principal supply. Moving to mixed supply. What do I mean by the term mixed supply? So one second. So what do I mean by mixed supply? Wherein two or more individual supplies are combined and made in conjunction with each other and are taxed and are provided by a taxable person at a single price. So let's assume that these are not naturally bundled, but I have created an artificial bundle of an items and have provided these items at a single price. For example, I have created an hamper in which I have sweets in it, I have aerated drinks in it, chocolates, biscuits. So in this case, all these items are taxable at separate rates. So for example, aerated drinks are taxable at 40%. Let's assume that other things are taxable at 5% and 18%. So what is the rate at which it should be taxed? So in case of mixed supply, it will be taxed at the highest rate. If items are supplied at a single price, it will be taxed at the highest rate which is applicable. So because at the aerated drinks, the rate which is applicable is 40%. So on the entire amount, 40% will be charged. So composite supply, the rate of the principal supply will be applicable. In case of mixed supply, the highest rate of tax would be applicable. Let's take some examples. So first transaction is in the nature of medicine supplied to inpatient. So there are patients who are admitted into hospital and for treatment medicines are being supplied. So will it fall under composite supply or mixed supply? So the answer is it will fall under composite supply because the predominant or the principal supply in this case is treatment or medical or healthcare services which are being provided and not the medicines. Similarly, next case wherein accommodation services are provided by boarding schools. So the main service which is there or the principal service which is there is what in this case? It is the education services. Therefore, it will be a composite supply. Supply of AC along with installation service. Again, it is a composite supply where the principal supply is sale of AC. In case of hotel accommodation with breakfast, it is a composite supply where the principal supplies are in relation to accommodation. Then there is coaching material with books. In such case, the coaching service which is provided will be the principal supply. Therefore, it is a composite supply. In case of supply of hamper, it will be a mixed supply. Laptops along with charger will be a composite supply where the principal supply will be of laptops. Laptop and printer, it will be a mixed supply because there is no predominant principal supply. Both are individual supplies and will be taxed at the highest rate. Coloring books for kids along with pencil box set. It is also a mixed supply. Sale of goods with delivery will be a composite supply wherein the predominant or the principal supply will be in relation to goods. Now that we have seen the levy part. Now, when will be the time when I should pay the tax would arise? So, this is determined in the time of supply provisions which are given under section 12 and 13 of the CGST Act. Section 12 talks about the taxation of goods, time of supply of goods, whereas section 13 talks about time of supply in case of services. So, before we go into details of time of supply, we should first understand when the issuance of invoice is to be done in case of goods. So generally, the invoice in relation to goods where supply is happening, where the goods involve supply or movement of goods. For example, goods are to be moved from location A to B. In such case, invoice is to be prepared on or before removal of goods for supply. So, for example, if I've received an order on, let's say, 8th November, and I have removed the goods on, let's say, 10th November for movement, and the goods have reached at the location on 15th November, when should I raise the invoice? The invoice should be prepared on or before the removal, which is the 10th November. In other cases where the goods do not involve movement, in such cases, the time for issuing invoice will be on or before the delivery. For example, a person walks into a retail store, buys the goods, gives the payment to the trader, and takes the goods with him. So in this case, the invoice is to be prepared on or before delivery. When the goods are delivered to him, before that, the invoice should be issued, or on that date, the invoice should be issued. In cases where so this is basically general rule of invoices wherein continuous supply is there. In such case, continuous supply of goods, in case where successive statements are to be issued, in such case, on or before the issuance of such statement, the invoice has to be prepared. In case where successive payments are received, on or before issuance of such payment being received, the invoice has to be prepared. There are cases where goods are sent on approval for sale. So goods have not been supplied as of now, but are sent only for approval. Once the approval has been received, then the supply will happen. So in such case, before or at the time of supply, जब supply हो जाएगा, जब उसका approval आ जाएगा, तो before that date or till that date, the invoice should be prepared, or 6 months from the date of removal, whichever is earlier. So if I have sent the goods, ठीक है, 6 महीने तक भी उसका अप्रूवल नहीं आया है, ठीक है, then I will have to prepare the invoice in accordance with before or at the time of supply, or 6 months from the date of removal, whichever is earlier. Now, one interesting thing which was added, Rule 47A, talks about self-invoicing. Wherever I have received some goods from an unregistered buyer, unregistered dealer, and those goods are liable for RCM, in such cases, I am required to issue a self-invoice. this self invoice has to be prepared within 30 days from the date of receipt. Because we are talking about goods, it is within 30 days from receipt of goods. So this is what is applicable in case of RCM. So I hope the invoice timelines are clear for issuance of invoice. Now we go to the time of supply provisions. So in case of forward charge, time of supply of goods will be date of issuance of invoice or the last date of issuance of invoice, whichever is earlier. So for example, the goods were removed for delivery on, let's say, 10th November, but the invoice was prepared on 12th November. So what will be the time of supply? The time of supply will be 10th November and not 12th November. The reason being, last date for issuance of invoice was one on or before removal of goods. Because goods have been removed on 10th and invoice is issued later on, the time of supply will be the last date of issuance. However, a notification 66 oblique 2017 was issued wherein a relief was given saying that in case of goods, time of supply is not on receipt basis. It will always be on the issuance of invoice basis. But however, in case of forward charge, in case of specified actionable claims, do you remember the specified actionable claims? Lottery, betting, gambling, other things which were there, horse racing, casino games. In such cases, it will be either the date of receipt of payment, last date of issuance of invoice, or date of issue of invoice, whichever is earlier. So here there is no benefit of time of supply not being on receipt. For forward charge on specified claim, you will have to check the payment date also. So this is in relation to time of supply of goods. Moving to reverse charge. Reverse charge in case of goods, the date of receipt of goods or date of payment to the recipient or supplier's invoice date plus 31 days, whichever is earlier will be the time of supply in case of reverse charge. In cases where I cannot identify the time of supply by ABC clauses, in that case, the date of entry in the books of accounts of the recipient will be treated as the time of supply of goods in case of RCM. Moving to time of supply of services. So in case of time of supply of services, before going into that, we should first see the time limit for issuance of invoice. So time limit for issuance of invoice in general scenario is when the normal cases, normal supplier, when the completion of service has happened, from that date till 30 days from that, you can prepare an invoice. For example, my service is completed on 1st of October. So I have time limit till 30 days. So invoice date, so date of completion plus 30 days is there for issuance of invoice. In case of insurance, banking and NBFC companies, the time limit for from 30 days has been increased to 45 days. This is only for specified class. That is insurance, banking, FIs, that is FIs is financial institutions and non-banking financial companies. In case of continuous supply, wherein due date of payment is ascertainable from the contract on or before the due date of payment, where the due date is not ascertainable on or before the supplier receives the payment. Third is where the payment is linked to some completion of an event. So on or before the completion of such event will be the time for issuance of invoice. In cases where the service has ceased before completion, so a contract was entered between the supplier and the recipient, but the recipient ceases to take the services before the completion. In such case, invoice has to be prepared at the time of supply ceases, and the invoice amount will be of up to what, to the extent the supplies were made up to the date of cessation. तो इतने अमाउंट का इनवॉइस बनाना पड़ेगा. Now time limits क्या है? So in case of forward charge, if the invoice for service is issued within time, it will be invoice date or receipt of payment, whichever is earlier. If invoice is not issued in time मतलब 30 दिन के अंदर नहीं हुआ है from the date of completion of service, so then in that case it will be date of completion of service or payment, whichever is earlier. Then if time of supply cannot be determined from A or B above, then date in which the recipient shows the receipt of services in his books will be the time of supply in case of forward charge of services. Reverse charge it is very easy. The date of payment, when payment is made to the recipient, either that date, payment is made to the supplier, either that date, supplier invoice date plus 61 days if the supplier is a registered person. जिससे आपने खरीदा है वो अगर registered person है तो in that case supplier invoice date plus 61 days whichever is earlier. Where the supplier is unregistered and you are required to prepare an self invoice, in that case date of payment or date of self invoice whichever is earlier. In case ABC से नहीं बन रहा है, आप टाइम ऑफ सप्लाई नहीं निकाल पा रहे हो, तो डेट ऑफ एंट्री इन द बुक्स ऑफ अकाउंट्स ऑफ द रेसिपिएंट will be the date on which the time of supply will be treated in case of services. Then coming to the residuary portion, that is the last portion in case of time of supply of goods or services. For payment received up to 1,000 rupees in excess of the invoice value, there is a proviso which is inserted under section 12 and 13 which says कि अगर आपको invoice value से 1,000 रुपए तक का excess amount मिल गया है तो आप इस 1,000 रुपए का जो एडवांस है इसके लिए आप टाइम ऑफ सप्लाई डिटरमाइन कर सकते हो एट द ऑप्शन ऑफ सप्लायर कुड बी दी डेट ऑफ इशू ऑफ नेक्स्ट इनवॉइस. तो आप ये नेक्स्ट इनवॉइस का जो डेट होगा उस डेट पे भी आप उसको एडजस्ट कर सकते हो provided the advance is up to rupees 1,000. See, it is not relevant in case of goods because in case of goods, the time of supply is only and only on the basis of date of issuance of invoice or last date of issuance of invoice. But in case of services, this becomes relevant. Now talking about residuary sections which are same in both goods as well as services. So I have taken both together. So where residuary situations where a time of supply cannot be determined under section 2, 3 of the time of supply provision. So subsection 5 says that where a person is liable to file periodical returns and has filed the return, the date on which such returns is to be filed will be treated as the time of supply. In cases where other than this situation, he is not liable to file periodical returns, he is unregistered. So the date on which tax is paid, that will be treated as the time of supply of the residuary situation. In cases where additional consideration is taken in the nature of interest, penalty, late fees, or delayed payments, in such cases, the time of supply will be the date when the supplier receives this additional payment. So, जब भी कभी उनको interest मिल जाएगा, that will be the date when the time of supply for payment of tax will arise on such receipts. So, friends, with this, we conclude levy, supply, as well as your time of supply provisions which are given under the GST Act. I hope I could convey and provide my insights. If you have any queries, you can surely drop down in the Q&A session, Q&A section, and we will surely solve your queries there. Thank you, friends. Thank you for your patient listening. Jay. Jay, am I audible? Hello, Jay.
Hello, sir. Yes, yes, you are audible. Hello.
Jay, I've completed the session now.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, sir, for your insightful
And
question, sir.
thank you, Jay. Thank you to Vikasa team as well. And I have stopped the recording, so it's okay, no?
Yes, yes, it's okay, sir.
Okay, okay. Chalo.
Yes,
Thank
yes.
you, Jay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yes.